as it tells you. All right. Well, thank you all for coming today. I hope you're as excited as I am. I'm actually hoping to ask a few of my own questions about growing veggies and getting that going, because don't we always have just a few questions about that? There's always something new every year. So my name is Denise Pinard, and I am a volunteer with the UC Master Gardeners of Monterey and Santa Cruz counties. And we're all here for our little support time here. Before we get started though, just to go through some of the housekeeping things that we do all the time. Of course, keep your microphone muted at this point. We'll have questions later on, and we may go ahead and, especially if we stay this smaller group, we can probably open that up later. But for now, we'll have you keep your microphones muted. Ideally, if you just go ahead and turn your video off, it's a little less distracting, and it helps with keeping our bandwidth in a good space so that we don't have any more technical problems. You may want to choose speaker view as the best way to get sort of the biggest screen usage with all the slides that we have going. And go ahead and use the chat window anytime during class and just put something in there. We may be able to answer it in real time, or for sure we will get to those questions. That's really the point of why we're here today, later on in the presentation. There is a, let's see, I don't think they call it live script, the live script button anymore, but there should be somewhere down the bottom, I swear I just saw it, a button for closed captioning. So keep an eye out for that if you'd like that. You can ask me directly in the chat if you have any questions for technical assistance, that kind of thing. And don't forget that the presentation is being recorded. We'll save that for you and send that off to you. Probably the link to that probably within a few days after that. So you'll have all the slides available to you, as well as what we all talk about. So not to worry about that if you miss anything. Let's see. On this one, it asks you to use the reaction buttons down at the bottom of the screen when asked to raise your hand. That's a great idea. So if you're comfortable with finding those reaction buttons, use them. They're great. All right, so a little bit about Master Gardeners. I know some of you actually, not only our team today, but a few others of you, I think, are Master Gardeners as well, but some of you may not know a whole bunch about it. We've been around for over 40 years now, working with the University of California with the Agriculture and Natural Resources Division. We receive comprehensive training, but we're all volunteers. Our mission really is to provide outreach and research-based education on horticulture, pest management, sustainable practices for our home gardeners in our own communities. So that's a little bit about us, and we hope that you enjoy the program tonight. I think I'm going to turn this over to Bridget, because I think you are ready to go on possibly the next slide.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight to learn a little bit about veggie growing and to present growing your own veggies. It's keeps us on our toes, and we always appreciate it. As Denise said, my name is Bridget, and I've been growing a variety of veggies, herbs, and flowers since I was a kid. Really, our family is made up of gardeners and cooks. So I've been doing both those things for quite some time. I'm also a master composter over the hill in Santa Clara. And I did the UCSC Farm and Garden Apprenticeship, and I stayed on after that and was an assistant manager for the Chadwick under Orrin Martin. And I believe I became a master gardener in 2014 and a master composter in 2016, but don't hold me to it because I never remember unless I look at my badges. Happy that you're here.
Okay. Oops. Sorry. My name's Harry Lee. I'm the other presenter today. I've been growing vegetables for about the last 45 years or so, since I was in high school. And I've been a master gardener since 2013. about half of that in 2/3 of that in Southern California, and the last 3 or 4 years up here in the Santa Cruz area. So we could be closer to our grandkids. Okay. There's our agenda. We'll go over just a touch on pretty much everything this evening. If you have questions, as was mentioned earlier, you can get them into the chat box. With a group this size, we should have plenty of time to answer all the questions you can come up with. But we're going to cover location, soil, amendments, plant nutrition, the plant's nutrition, not ours, the tools you need, what to plant when. We'll touch on pests. It's probably a couple of classes all by itself, but we'll get you started. And a few tips for summer vegetables. That's what most of us grow. That's what most home gardeners grow. I do like my winter garden, but summer one is the big one.
And what we wanted to point out, that most of you read when you signed up for this class, is that the intention of this class is that we're going to do kind of a quick overview of veggie growing. Sometimes we have more in-depth classes, but this time we're going to do like I said, a quick overview of growing. The main point of this class tonight, and especially the next two classes, will be a chance for question and answer, a chance for you to come back to us during different parts of your growing process to ask us what's going on with your plants, whether it might be some issues you're having, or hopefully you just want to share the successes you're having, and then we can all learn from those.
And I'll throw in one quick plug. If Watsonville is convenient for you, on Freedom Boulevard in Watsonville, we have a demonstration garden, and we are there Monday and Thursday, 9 a.m. to noon. And you're certainly welcome anytime to stop by with a gardening question or a problem. Or again, as Bridget said, to talk about your successes. We'd love to see you. Okay. On that subject of questions and problems, I'd like to make you aware of our hotline, our helpline. It's available by email at any time. If you have a pest problem or a disease issue, or just about any question you might come up with, if you email that hotline access address, somebody will get back to you within a couple of days. The topics are assigned to various master gardeners depending on what types of questions you're asking, and we do our very best, again, to get back to you as quickly as possible. And then the second website listed there is, of course, our main website, and class information, things like that are available at the website. But if you don't do much else, get much else from the class, that hotline access can be invaluable. And please send pictures. As somebody who's tried to answer questions without pictures, it's a challenge. So take a photo or two of your problem and drop us a line. Oops, sorry. One more resource. I'm going to gloss over it because it can be a little intimidating. There is a wealth of information available at the Integrated Pest Management Site maintained by the University of California. It's phenomenal. You can find out not only disease questions, pest questions, just everything is there, but it is not that first couple of times you get on there may not, it's not for the faint of heart, but it is a wonderful and very extensive source of information. Including, should you be using any pesticide information and the impact it has on the both good and bad insects in your garden. We are missing, there we go. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about site selection. You know, honestly, most of the time we're stuck with the site selection that we've got. Most of us are not going to move to get a sunnier garden plot. We are where we are. If you're in a community garden space, you kind of get the one that's assigned to you. But you want to understand what that means to what you're growing. You need a minimum of 6 to 8 hours of sunlight for a summer garden every day. As the saying goes, the best tomato in the world isn't going to grow particularly well in shade. Excuse me. Some shade is all right. Again, 12 hours is ideal. 6 hours will get you by. And you want to also, even though you're not starting out there, what's going on in the winter. The easiest thing to do is just to go out in your yard one day and look for the sunny parts, the sunny area every hour. You've got a complete picture of the yard when the shade is present or where the shade is present. And if at all possible, you want that just the sunniest parts of the yard for your summer vegetables. Okay. Again, same thing. 6 to 8 hours a day. You know, tomatoes would prefer to be closer to 12, and cucumbers will get by just fine with 6. But if you've got that 6 to 8 hours, you probably will be fairly successful with a summer vegetable garden. You want it near a water source. If there's a hose bib right there, that's great. If you need a hose, that's fine. Plants don't do real well without a water source. It's as important as the sunshine. If you can avoid a slope of any significance, that's a good idea. They're not impossible. A slope that's very steep is going to push you into raised beds for sure, which I generally recommend anyway. I'll talk about them from time to time. I mean, not only for pest management and soil management, water management, raised beds can be a handy thing. But if you're on a slope, they're almost a necessity. Wind can be a problem, but again, your site is what you've got. And so it's probably, other than knowing that it's there and maybe how you arrange the vegetables in the garden, you don't have a lot of play there. you need good drainage in your site. If the ground is saturated, most vegetables won't do very well. Perpetually saturated, I should say. They just won't do very well at all. They need that soil to drain so that they can actually do the process of taking up nutrients and that sort of stuff. Flowers, native plants are pretty much the same. If it's soggy all of the time, again, you're probably going to need to consider something more along the lines of raised beds. Again, we're stuck with our site, but soil is everything in a garden. You nourish the soil, and the soil grows the plants, is basically what you're doing. Oops, I'm sorry. Mouse is a little overly sensitive today. This is a general idea of what your soil is made up of. The better the soil, the closer to this little pie chart you're going to get. It's mostly air, water, and rocks, minerals. The really important part is the 5% of organic matter that Bridget will talk about here real quickly. But that's the part of the soil too that you can really change. It's very difficult to turn clay into loam, basically an impossibility. But you can add organic matter and greatly increase your chances of success in growing your vegetables. Okay. There it is. If you're starting out, I don't have a current cost. A few years ago, they were about $35, so they could be anywhere from $50, $75 now. But you might consider a soil test. They're not particularly difficult. This one happens to be from A&L Western Labs. They have pretty straightforward instructions on their website how to put together a soil sample that you can send to them, and they'll tell you the condition of your soil, especially in the macro and micronutrient category. They'll also tell you what your organic matter percentage is. It can be quite helpful in avoiding nutrient problems with plants. And there are lots of these labs around, several of them in Watsonville. Earlier today, I did a Google search using UCANR soil test, and the University of California popped up a nice little file that had a couple of dozen labs listed. Some in our area. A&L actually is in Modesto. That part doesn't really matter. You package the material up and send it off to them. But it can be a handy tool when you're starting out to see what condition your soil's in, what nutrient levels you may need to compensate for, or pay extra attention to. And if it's in the budget, it's probably worthwhile. Oops. Okay. Bridget, it's all yours.
All right, everybody. I'm sorry that I'm a little bit in the dark. I hope that you can all hear me well. I live in a tiny home, and we don't have a lot of control of what we can do with all that in our little tiny space. But hopefully you can see me well enough to get through the presentation. In this slide, we're talking about what is fertilizer versus soil amendment, because it really helps to know the difference between the two. Fertilizer, kind of easy thing to keep in mind, feeds your plants. Soil amendment feeds your soil. Fertilizer, as we're saying here, affects the plant through the growth, through different types of nutrients that you might be giving it. Soil amendments indirectly affect the plant by improving the soil physical and chemical properties and making water and different nutrients more available to the plant. And then underneath that, we have examples of fertilizers, which would be bone meal, fish emulsion, meal, kelp, feather meal, green. And then under soil amendments, different examples that would be aged manures, compost, worm castings, leaves and grass clippings, peat moss, coconut coir, and tilled in cover crops. Next slide, please, Harry. I think we skipped one there. Oh, okay, sorry. All right, how much amendment do we want? Honestly, I don't think that you can add too much organic compost to your soils, especially in the beginning. If you've just moved into a place and maybe you're dealing with some clay impacted soils, the best thing that you can do is to add compost. And sometimes when I'm out and about consulting, I might suggest people that have arrived into a new space, maybe to not even grow that year, actually to concentrate on improving their soil before they even plant, by adding compost and cover cropping in that soil. The levels that we want of compost and organic matter in our soils take years. A good time to add it is before you plant. For me, I'm a typical 3-season grower. So I typically grow in spring, summer, and fall, excuse me. And I don't do a lot of winter growing. So for me, I'm adding compost at each of those seasons. And I cover crop for winter and kind of let my gardens be. A good thing to keep in mind is 3 to 6 inches of layer of some sort of really good compost. We've got some math there for you to review. For me, math goes like that, way over my head. So I just like to keep in mind that I'm adding 3 to 6 inches of layer, 3 to 6 inches of compost into my growing medium, whatever that might be, whether it's in the soil, whether it's in a pot, whether it's in a grow bag. That's like got something that I have in the back of my mind, and that is really kind of all of that I need. But we also have a really awesome calculator in this slide that you can click on, and you can add in the exact dimensions of your garden and get back exactly how much compost organic material you should be adding. Next slide, please. In this slide, we're checking out some finished compost sources for you. Things that we like to look for is organic certification, OMRI, CDA, CCOF, mostly not necessarily concerned with being an organic grower, but that those sources of compost are really healthy sources for your soil. And also, especially if you're growing veggies, you know that everything in that compost is going to be healthy for your veggies and healthy for you to eat. Things that you might want to avoid is bag steer manure, if you see that in your garden stores, mostly because sometimes it haven't leached out of that, it hasn't been finished properly, and that can do more damage to your soil than benefit. All compost is going to have some sort of forest product in it, and we can't get too upset about that, but we don't want to see big, huge chunks of it in our compost bags if we're buying it from a nursery, because for instance, you know, redwood can be a little bit empathic, so that can be detrimental to trying to grow certain plants. So it's okay if you see some of it, but not too much of it. And it's really like easy to check just by doing a physical check of that bag. When it comes to municipal green waste compost, it's a really great free source of compost. It's something that I would choose to put around my trees, my shrubs, my more plants that I have kind of growing more for the beauty of them, not necessarily for food production, just because we don't necessarily know everything that goes into the municipality compost program. Sometimes they're fantastic, sometimes they're not. So if I'm going to go and pick up a load from them, I use that for other things other than my veggie beds. We're also throwing out here some recommended sources of bag compost that you would find in our local groceries, things that have tried and true brands. One Earth at Just Landscape is really great. Also, the compost that they make themselves is really great. Garden and Bloom is a good source, as are, you know, several of our brands that we'll see locally. 100% worm compost you can never go wrong with. We just want to make sure that you're that you're purchasing it from trusted brands. So in this slide, we're talking about material sources for compost. The best material sources for compost and adding organic to your garden beds or grow bags is for you to create your own compost, or for you to start to add your own vermicompost to your garden beds, grow pots, and or grow bags. Outside of that, we've kind of gone over it a little bit, but if you're going to go to the garden supply store, you might buy it back. You might go to a place like Aptos Landscaping. If you have a truck, they fill the back of your truck with it. Those are good options. We already talked a little bit about the pluses and minuses of getting your compost from our municipal waste systems. Horse stables are an amazing source of finished horse manure. Most of the time, if you live anywhere, like I live in Watsonville, I live in horse country, most of the folks here would be glad to see me show up with a truck and say, can I take your finished horse manure? And they would say yes, and give it to you for free. Our grocery stores have a lot of produce waste that you can pick up. Your own leaves and that you have around your property. Buying straw, like maybe you already have chickens, you might, you know, want to save some of that straw to compost with. Lawn clippings are a great source. If you have chickens or rabbits, their manure is fantastic. And you can pick up spent grains from our local breweries, and also all of our local coffee shops will gladly give you their spent coffee grounds. Next. About fertilizer. So in this slide, we're just trying to figure out what we mean by fertilizer. And as we said earlier, fertilizer is something that we will apply to specifically grow plants, not necessarily amend our soil. For the most part, you want to apply some sort of slow release fertilizer that will work for you over time. In the beginning of planting, most of us would choose to use some sort of powder form of that we mix into the soil that we are about to plant our transplants into. And then later on, we might choose a liquid form to feed our plants with, something like a fish emulsion. We like to cover NPK. Anytime that you buy a bag of fertilizer, you will see those letters on the bag, NPK, and they stand for nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium. And they do different things. And you can see on our slide here, which I think is done really well, nitrogen is for greens and for plants, and you kind of want to think like up above the ground. What's growing up above the ground? My greens. Phosphorus reaches down to the roots, and that's really good for something that we want to grow below the soil, but also that we want to really support the fruiting of above the soil. And then potassium is an overall thing. It does a little bit of both in our veggie plants. And underneath those categories, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, the plant part under nitrogen, we have leaves and lush green growth. Under phosphorus, we have fruiting and flowers. And under potassium, we have root development, strong stems, helping to transport the nutrients. So when you're in the when you're in the nursery, the plant nursery store, and you are trying to pick out like what exactly is the fertilizer that I might want, what I like to keep back of my mind is, what is my goal? So if my goal is fruiting, which that would be a lot of our vegetable plants like tomatoes, because it's technically, not technically, it's actually a fruit, right? Or our flowers, things like that. After the fruit, then I want to make sure that there's a nice source of potassium in that. Come fall time, if I'm maybe going to start wanting to think about growing beets and carrots and rutabaga and things like that in the fall, then I might want to concentrate a little bit more on the potassium, because that's going to help with that bulb development, which is exactly what we're going to eat. Okay, next slide. This is a slide that we took at San Lorenzo Garden Supply downtown, and we're just covering some tried and true good sources that, you know, if you buy from one of these companies, Garden and Bloom, Sustain, Dr. Earth, Down to Earth, that they're going to do right by you. And their actual NPK numbers work, and that you can expect whatever they're telling you is going to provide you fertilizer for your plants is going to be true on the front of their bag or their box, however you're purchasing it. Next slide, please. Here we're highlighting a little bit of special nutrient needs for summer veg. Tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants might be a good idea to add a little bit of colloidal rock phosphate or bone meal for calcium to prevent blossom end rot. They're heavy feeders, so you're going to want to be mindful to feed them several times throughout their growing season. Corn and squash are also heavy feeders, and they enjoy a lot of nitrogen and water. Beans kind of produce their own nitrogen, so you don't really need to be too concerned with that. And flowers were most likely like phosphorus and potassium, like I was speaking about earlier, because phosphorus really promotes flowering. So of course, if we're growing flowers, we want to make sure that we're giving them something that will support them. And potassium, overall plant health, root health. And greens love nitrogen, because that is kind of that uproot growth that we were talking about earlier, and they will really benefit from something like a fish emulsion. Here, highlighting for the new gardener some basic tools that you might want to have on hand. In that upper left corner, we have a garden rake. Then we move on to a set of really nice pruners. Upper right corner is our garden spade. Below that is a garden fork, which is really nice for tilling soil with. And then, of course, we've got a hose and, and depending on what type of sprinkler you would want on the end of your hose. And then rounding the other way in the bottom left, we have our garden spade. The one thing that I recommend as far as is that when you're a new gardener, test out your tools, make sure it's something that you're going to love to do. If it's kind of like a big spendy thing that you're thinking about that you're thinking about maybe purchasing, let's say a garden spade, maybe make sure that gardening's for you before you do it. And maybe you've got a neighbor that you can borrow some tools from, or a really good friend that you can borrow some tools from. And once you know that I really enjoy this, I see myself doing this once or twice a year, it might be time to invest in good tools. And the reason that is because good tools will last you a lifetime if you take care of them. I have my original Felcos that I purchased in my 20s that I sharpen a couple times a year, and they're still holding strong for me, as opposed to buying something that might break or rust on you and end up in the landfill. Just go ahead, as you know that you are going to become a gardener, go ahead and invest some tools that are going to last you a long time. Next slide, please. After that, we've got some you might enjoy having garden gloves. I know that I do. I use their hands all the time. My wheel I honestly use when it's time to add compost. I could probably get away with Home Depot buckets, but those loads of Home Depot buckets are getting harder and harder for me to carry, so I really appreciate having my small wheelbarrow around. And of course, I wear a hat when I can, and when you're watering, it's nice to have some sort of waterproof shoes so you don't come back in, soaking wet with your tennies that need to dry overnight. Next slide, please.
Okay. Now we're going to start. Kind of along the same line as Bridget's comment on the tools, it's probably not a good idea to lay out 1,000 square feet of garden beds on your first trip into summer vegetable growing. Start with something that you can manage. If it's a 1 4x8 raised bed, perfect. If it's half a dozen containers on your patio where they get enough sun, because mine don't, that's fine. Start with something that you can manage. If you're going to have a much more difficult time being successful if you start out with more space than you can truly manage. You need to find out how much time you're going to spend in the garden. How much time do you have? How much time does it take? Do you really like doing it? It's best to take it one step at a time. Pick out a few.
And we like to suggest that you pick plants that you really enjoy eating. I think most of us really love tomatoes. A pepper that does really well in our area is a a shishito. And you know, it's wrong with a zucchini. So maybe pick that you investigate and really learn to make peppers, and add in something that is going to be really hard to fail at, like a zucchini, and learn a lot about those plants over one season. And then maybe the next season you add in something else that you enjoy eating. Maybe the next season you're going to get really into growing different types of greens. And what we're trying to say is to set yourself up for success. And sometimes if we start too big and we try to grow every vegetable under the sun in the very beginning, it's a little bit too much too fast, and it can make us feel maybe that we're not successful as a veggie grower. But all we needed to do was maybe start a little bit slower, learn plants, you know, a season at a time, and add slowly into our garden plants.
Let me go back real quick and touch it before I turn it back over to Bridget where it's supposed to be. Just about anything that you can grow in the summer vegetable category, you can grow in a container, in a pot. You don't want to try to raise a tomato in a 1 gallon, but I've been relatively successful with cherry tomatoes, for lack of a better description, with the small tomatoes in a pot that's as little as 5 gallons. It's just, peppers are pretty easy. Even excuse me, even things like zucchini and cucumbers will make it in a relatively small container. So if this is a good way to start for you, then don't be afraid to pick those 2 or 3 vegetables that you want to try for your first year and raise them in pots.
Yeah, and what we're trying to also point out here is, you know, we live in farm country. So as we're farms, I think, you know, you might think that you need all this land to have a vegetable garden, or that you need it all. But really, most vegetables do well in various types of pots. So if what you have to grow is a patio or a cemented driveway or a little, you know, sidewalk as next to your entryway into your home, you can still grow veg. And as Harry was saying, it can be in any kind of container. You can drill holes into old Home Depot containers. You can buy buckets from 5 to 10 to 15 to 25. I love those grow bags. If you've been to the Love Apple Farm demo garden where they teach their classes and also sell their veggie starts, their demo garden is done in those grow bags. Those are fantastic. They've got handles. You can put them around your yard as the sun changes. And we're just trying to point out that if you have soil to grow in, that's great. But if you don't, you also have options of growing in pots, on your porch, in your cemented backyard, along your driveway, whatever your options are. So you can go to the next slide, Harry. So as most of you know, this class was a little bit delayed due to technical difficulties with our site, and also a little bit of the crazy weather we had with our 12 consecutive rainstorms, atmospheric rainstorms. So when we're talking about this slide, we're obviously talking about times, but we had a little bit of a crazy rain year, and then after that came a pretty heavy, foggy, cloudy time before we really got sun. I'm from the Northwest, so it was very close to living in the Northwest since last November. So when you see these vegetables to plant April to May, the ideal scene. Most of us this particular year have probably waited until the end of May, early June to get some of these plants in the ground, because that's when the weather was cooperating with us. But in a typical year, in those months, it would be great to transplant tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, gourds. It'd be a good time to direct seed your beans, your beets, your corn, radishes, potatoes. And then down here, you could either direct seed or transplant cucumbers and winter and summer squash. On this slide, I do like to point out to very brand new gardeners, because I have heard this question a lot in different classes that I've taught, that winter squash didn't do well for them because they planted it in the winter. And it's a good idea to take time to learn our garden lingo. So winter and summer squash actually get planted pretty much at the same time. And it's really about when you're harvesting that winter or summer squash and how long you can hold it. So summer squash, we're harvesting earlier. Winter squash, we're harvesting a little bit later, and we can hold it over the winter. It doesn't mean that's when you plant it in the winter. And, you know, sometimes that lingo sets people up to fail, but you're attending this class, so now you know that. And hopefully we're going to do a better job at letting people know exactly what we mean by things like those terms, winter versus summer. On this slide, we have some links to the USDA hardiness zone. That's fantastic, because when you go in one of our lovely local nurseries and you're looking at plants to buy, you want to make sure that you see your hardiness zone on that plant label. And that lets you know that that plant is going to do well in our coldest zone. Semi-hardiness is a gentler version of that. It's before we get to like our freezing temps, and that lets you know that our plants are going to do well at those temps. On that USDA hardiness zone map, you can type in your zip code and it will come up with a zone that works for you. I live in Watsonville. My zone's 9B. Of course, you can play with that a little bit. I do quite well with 9A plants. There's some A plants I do well with. There's some 10 plants that I do well with. But it gives me the knowledge that I need when I walk into the nursery to pick up a plant and read that description and look for the zone and say, oh, okay, that is zoned for me. I'm most likely going to be successful with this plant. I love our local nurseries. They do a really good job, but they're in the business of selling plants to us. And sometimes they carry plants that might not do well in our areas, or maybe won't do well in the way that they sell them. One example would be there are some plants that don't do well transplanted, like beets, carrots, rutabagas, things that are like your root crops, even radishes. I see those starts in our local nurseries all the time. When those plants are better started from seed, doesn't mean it won't work, but it does mean it might not work. And you might think, oh, well, I tried to grow that and it didn't work, so I don't have a green thumb and I can't be a gardener. That's not true. It's a little bit that maybe that nursery was setting you up to fail a little bit by selling those starts. So knowing what's best to start from to transplant, what your hardiness zone is, that helps you walk into that new nursery a little bit smarter and understanding what would be a wise choice for you. The reference below that is done by my good friend Elise, one of our fantastic partners. And in that guide, she did an extensive job for you of what is good to plant from seed or to plant in a seed starting situation in the winter and what's best to transplant it. If it's a summer crop, a winter crop, how long it takes to germinate. It's a fantastic guide. I use it all the time. And she put a lot of work and effort into that. And it's fantastic. It's one of the best guides that I have ever seen. And it's by one of our own master gardeners. All right, Harry, if we can go to the next slide.
Oops. Hold on just a second here. We'll get it back where it belongs. I think that's the next slide.
And we're talking about a few examples of good transplanted or seeded, and really needs to be seed and then transplanted. You do that yourself, that at the nursery and transplant it. And we've got some examples there of you to check out. All right, next slide. Cool season crops. When we were talking about this in our summer veggie class, these are stuff may or may not do well for you, just depending on how our season goes. Sometimes we have a pretty mellow season, and even though we might be dealing with drought conditions, although not recently, it might be mellow as far as the heat goes, and these plants will work out for you, such as lettuces, cabbages, artichokes, kale, chard. If we get a bout of really hot weather, as we have experienced through the past years, it might mean that your lettuce just immediately bolts on you and goes to flower. Same with your kale and your arugula, things like that. For me, sometimes personal experience, I prefer to grow things in the cabbage family in the fall, winter months. I find when I try to grow them in the summer, not only they take more water, more mulch, sometimes I even have to put a shade cover over them. They bring some friends to the garden that I don't want to deal with, like a lot more aphids that I might be dealing with if I hadn't planted in the summer. So we're not saying that they won't work. We're just using that word because depending on what the weather does for you, it might be fantastic and it might just be a pain. So those are just things for you to consider while you're deciding what you want to grow. We get this question a lot: how much, when, how long? And it's one of those answers to the questions that we say, it depends. Unfortunately, we can't give you any hard try info to watering, but we have some guidelines. If your schedule allows, morning time is best. It's good to avoid watering at night because that can lead to maybe some mildew and fungus issues that you don't want to invite. We don't like sprinklers. I know in farm country you're driving through and you're seeing sprinklers all over the time in our commercial growing fields. And that is something that they do to get their crops going in the very beginning after they've direct seeded or transplanted. And then they'll switch to drip. So when you're driving and seeing those overhead sprinklers, that's something that is done in that commercial sense. It's typically not something that we need to do at home. A lot of that water just evaporates into the air. Even though we've had a pretty intense winter, we still want to be water wise. And the best thing is to avoid sprinklers in general. How much is enough is another one of those it depends question, but the easiest way to determine that is use your hands. So what you want to do is look at the back of your seed packet or your seed magazine and try to get an estimate of how deep, how deep that root growth is going to be. It might be 2 inches deep. It might be 6 inches deep. And what you want to do is make sure the water gets to the root depth of that plant. And the best way to do that is to water. And maybe you've done the job. Stick your hand in the soil to whatever depth that is, that would be. Is it 2 inches? Is it 12 inches? And have you got the water to that root depth? And if you've done that, then you've watered enough. Most plants prefer a deep watering once or twice a week rather than a surface watering every day, because that watering is not getting, and that's what we're concerned with, the root zone. We want to make sure that root zone, whatever depth that is of that plant, is getting watered. Mulch everything. That is a fantastic way to keep the water from evaporating from, so that you don't need to water. It can be through wood chips, old compost, ways to mulch, just to prevent that evaporation from the soil.
Okay, we're going to touch on pests here real quickly. Again, I'll let you know that the UCIPM is there. If I were doing it, I would send off, I had something eating, for example, eating my cabbage or whatever that is. I'd send a picture or two off to the hotline and see if I can't get their help in determining what it is that I'm suffering from. These are probably some of the most common pests that you'll have in the garden, certainly in the summer garden. A lot of these folks don't bother with fall, winter vegetables nearly as much aphid do, but they're usually in lower numbers and more easily controlled. But in the summer, everybody's happy, everybody's out, everybody's in the sunshine, and they're just after your plants. And in the slide, each of these will take you to the, if you click on this, each of them will take you to the UCIPM pest notes for that little creature. You'll see probably most commonly aphid. I think it's pretty easily the most common pest that I get in my garden. Actually, snails and slugs have come back a lot this year because of all the rain. They were almost non-existent during the drought. They just need the moisture. They're especially hard on transplants, snails and slugs are. Otherwise, the damage that they'll do if they're not just completely out of control is relatively less. Leaf miners, I don't have much trouble with it. It's actually a fly that lays an egg in between the two epidermis layers of the leaf. And unless the infestation is pretty bad, they won't generally impact the fruit growing plants like tomatoes, cucumbers, squash. The cucumber beetle and European cabbage butterfly. The cabbage butterfly is, in my experience, pretty darn common around here. They actually lay eggs underneath the leaf. You can, and they'll lay on quite a few different plants. I don't find them on tomatoes too much, but outside of that, I have found them even on peppers. squash, and in the fall, you may see them on the brassicas on cabbage and broccoli and cauliflower. They're very pretty, and you'll see them flitting around the garden. If you can control their eggs, there's also biological controls for the cabbage butterfly that you can find out about by clicking on that link. The cucumber beetle is, again, you're back to trying to control the environment, make sure that they're not finding other host plants. You can try picking them off if you see them. You can look for their eggs. Also, again, on the excuse me, on the underside of the leaf. But they do not have a good biological control, either organic or inorganic, or stronger pesticides. They can be a little tough. And they're also a vector for some of the mosaic viruses, which are difficult to deal with as well. Let's switch to the vertebrates. There's really only one. You may have trouble with mice and rats. It's not nearly as common as gophers. Gophers are, I think for many gardeners, me included, the worst pests that we get. They're pretty difficult to deal with. The mice and rats are more easily excluded or trapped, and just much easier to control. And if you don't have a place for the rats, especially to live, then they're not likely to be in your garden. But gophers in Santa Cruz County, Monterey County are just absolutely everywhere. You can try and trap them. It's a challenge. I think the much easier approach is excluding them. Another reason that I'm a big raised bed fan. You can underwire a raised bed, and you've got, depending on the kind of wood you use, anywhere from 3 to a good 5 or 6 years of protection from the gopher. It's just a lot easier. They do make wire baskets that you can put an individual plant in, and they certainly do work. It just gets relatively expensive as you move along. But if you're starting out without a raised bed, and you have evidence of gophers in your yard, I highly recommend that you use the wire gopher baskets that you can get at any of our nurseries. They're fairly hungry little animals, and eventually they will eat pretty much everything you want to grow. They'll start with peppers and beans. They especially seem to like my beans, but they'll go after squash, both summer and winter. And when they've taken everything else, they will eventually start chewing on the tomatoes as well. Moles, just to mention it, they will be a real pain if you have a lawn. They're a lot less of a problem in most vegetable gardens. They don't eat the plants, but they will disturb the soil to some degree. I just, in fact, as we have one in the garden now, I just ignore it. It isn't really doing any damage. We flatten out the ground, and that's that.
All right, so we're getting it's already almost 6:15 now, and I know we started a couple minutes early, but I'm betting that you have some questions, and we can maybe flip back to some of these slides if they are pertinent. So if you have questions specifically, honestly, we're a small enough group, we could probably try unmuting and see how that goes. Or you can raise a hand if you want to. And see what that is. I've got a couple of questions that have come up as we've gone along here. Harry, was there anything that you really needed to get in here before we move
No,
on?
not at all. I'd much rather answer the questions.
Let's do it then. All right. So the first one that came in was quite a while ago, and I think we were talking, Bridget, about adding compost. The 3 to 6 inches. So the question was just, does this apply to container and raised beds? And if that wasn't what it meant, I kind of inferred that. So if that's a different question someone has, please speak up. But I think that's what it was.
Thank you. The 3 to 6 inches is definitely more when you're growing in the ground. So if I am a pot, which I do often, I would probably switch that to about 2 to 4. You know, so it depends. It's one of the questions because I have some huge pots and I have some little tiny pots. So it's a general estimate of the size of your pot and what you're growing. So the 3 to 6 inches, you know, typical growing in ground situation. And then when it comes to your pots, well, is it a 10-inch pot? Is it a huge, 24-inch pot, by the diameter of the pot? And then you can determine from that. But only for the most part, yeah, too much compost.
And Mark has raised his hand.
Yeah, go ahead
Yes.
and unmute Mark.
Hello, do you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, hello. Thank you for all. It's really interesting. I'm a kind of a new hands-on gardener, although I've been around gardens a lot over my long life. But I just recently, like 2 years ago, moved into Sunset Beach, which is Watsonville, but really, I live on a sand dune. And so I assumed that I needed to do everything in either barrels or raised beds because the sand wasn't going to be receptive to my plants. But so I got all these inexpensive barrels. I cut them in half. I made my soil. I added amendments. I got recommendations from various people. And so one is, was that wrong to think that my sandy soil was not good enough to just make amendments with and use more raised beds and not just have amended soil in the barrels? And I mean, it goes on from there because I'm having some success, but some failures as well.
No, you're not wrong. Sandy soil is to try to grow in, and the best bet that you could do is to put raised beds above that sandy soil or grow in exactly what you said, wine barrels or grow bags or grow buckets. That's I know where you live. I picked up from you in Watsonville, Aptos Hills. And if I were there, I would definitely raise beds and I would definitely do containers. That soil has been there a long time and it's going to take a long time for you to amend it. So your best bet is to create some sort of culture that you have total control over. And what you would have total control over is raised beds or grow bags or grow pots.
Right. Great. That's great. Thank you. I appreciate you confirming that. I've been kind of making my soil with like a third of my sandy stuff, a third kind of a pot, raised bed soil, and a third compost from Aptos. And my problem is that the greens don't grow. So whether it's potatoes, I get tiny little green leaves, but it's not like the big abundant potato plant that you see. And that's pretty much the way it is with all of the green growth that I need.
Potassium and phosphorus. Especially.
One thing I would suggest is I would take the sand down to a lot less in that soil addition that you have, where you've done a third of everything. I'd really take that sand down to probably even like a quarter or less, and concentrate more on the compost and the soil. And also just remembering where you live. You know, you live right on the coast, and there are some plants that don't do that well with the salt spray, and being in that much fog all the time that we have in our beautiful area that we live. So I would keep those in mind. Reduce your sand content, and understand when you're purchasing plants or the plants that you're hoping to grow, that they do well on the coast, because you're in the coastal zone, and that changes it a bit.
Yeah, and I've been trying to add fish meal or fish emulsion and kelp just to increase the nitrogen, thinking that that's going to increase my green growth.
It will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Well,
but for potatoes especially, you are looking at how many hours of sunlight they get. They're part of the same plant family as tomatoes, peppers.
Yeah. My Stupice tomatoes are doing gangbuster.
Okay, well then maybe, as Bridget said, with less sand, you'll have less leaching of your nutrients. Potatoes are into phosphorus and to a lesser degree, potassium. And once you get to the stage where the flower buds start to come out, the nitrogen's going to be a lot less important.
I just haven't been able to get my plants up to that point where I get flowers.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you might give fertilization a try for a season and see if that helps.
Okay.
Otherwise, it may, even though you're getting great results out of the tomatoes, it may be, like Bridget said, just not a great environment for potatoes.
Or just the way I mix the soil for the tomato plants versus.
And also, growing them in a container. I mean, I know there's like spendy potato grower things that you can buy, but you don't necessarily need that. There's all kinds of ways to adapt to growing potatoes with something that you have on hand, whether it be grow bags or turning a bucket into a potato grower, but having more control over that situation in a container would be better. They also need room when they're in the soil. They need room to develop. And sometimes sandy soil is too loose and weird, and sometimes a clay soil, they can't make the room. So there's a lot of conditions that affect how we grow potatoes. I think for a lot of our areas around Santa Cruz and Monterey County, your best bet is actually to grow them in a container rather than in the soil.
I absolutely agree. If you have a series of raised beds and you're a big tomato fan, or peppers for that matter, potatoes make it hard to do the crop rotation because it isn't, I planted them this year, I won't plant them in the same place next year kind of thing, because the little tiny pieces of potato that you leave in the ground come up again. So once you planted potatoes in a container, a raised bed or in the ground, they're going to be there for several years before you're going to be able to pull the last little
I
self-started
got it.
seedling out.
Uh,
And they are not a good companion plant for tomatoes, especially.
Okay. Yeah, well, I don't want to dominate the questions, but I really appreciate it. This is my first
Oh,
year.
no worries.
This is my first year with
Questions, and,
actually
you're-
planting.
All right.
Oh.
So how about, Harry, how about we go ahead and stop screen sharing? That way we can all see each other a little bit better for right now.
I'll do that.
All right. Great. There we go.
And Mark,
then-
your wig question, it would be for me, diatomaceous earth or sluggo works really well for earwigs.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, my goal, and I'm really committed, so I've gone kind of big time, even though, you know, who knows if I'm gonna get, I've gone a little overboard, but my goal is to find not just a variety of food that I want to eat, but I want the best version, best variety for the best, the most luscious taste. And, you know, I'm willing to do worm, you know, composting and worm teas and do whatever it takes to get really tasty vegetables that I can't get in my CSA box or at my, you know, my great natural food store.
Well, I love that goal. And as a master composter, I'll say vermicompost and will help you get goals. But the real deal in that goal is to grow the right plant in the right zone. So you need to learn your growing habit, and that is what's going to bring you all of those vegetables that taste amazing and perfect and set you up for success, because you're growing the plant that works in that zone.
Mm-hmm.
And for us, you know, because I've never lived in so many microclimates, change from house to my best friend's house in downtown Santa Cruz to our other best friend's house in the Santa Cruz Mountains. All these areas that I can live to within 30 minutes are all different growing zones.
Yeah.
But one thing that I is an amazing situation for us as far as tomatoes grow is grow sun gold cherry tomatoes, and I think they should be called Santa cherry tomato because they do well in all different zones and get those gorgeous tomatoes that taste fantastic, whether you're in Monterey Bay or Carmel or Watsonville or on the ocean like you are.
I'm sorry.
It's coming back to what we were promoting earlier.
You're sort of cutting out.
I know I can talk too much. That kept us back.
No, not enough. Santa Cruz tomato, is that the name of it?
Sun gold, right? Bridget,
Oh,
you were
sun
talking about
gold,
sun
yeah.
gold. Right.
Yeah.
All right, let's go ahead and poor
Marcia's
been waiting a long time.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you
let's
very
move
much.
on question wise.
All right.
I'm sorry, I don't know
you.
if it's Marcia or Marcia.
It's
However
Marcia.
you say
Hello,
it.
everyone. Question is going to be about zucchini. Everyone says zucchini is the easiest thing to grow. Well, I'm doing something wrong. So I have a container because I didn't want to take over. I have 2 4x8 raised vegetable beds. I live in Monterey, about 5 blocks from the beach. So it's foggy way too much, and it's, you know, coastal, and it's got that salt spray. But my question is this: it happened 2 years in a row, and I'm doing something wrong. And that is, I get flowers, and I get a ton of flowers, and then they die, and I don't get one zucchini, not one. They flower, and I get nothing. And also the leaves get that little moldy stuff on it. So the question is,
the mold and the flower drop are probably not the same problem. The fuzzy white mold is powdery mildew, and it will eventually kill the plant, but generally speaking, not until October or November. A flower drop is the more interesting question, or the more difficult question. Wow.
Somebody told me I should get a Q-tip and try to, get the stamen, the pistil, and pollinate it to try to get it to fruit, because I get flowers and then they just shrivel up and fall off, and I haven't gotten
Well,
one fruit yet.
it could be a pollination problem. You might, midday when it's kind of, the fog's gone away a little bit, you can go out and look at the flower, and generally you will see anywhere from 1 to sometimes as many as a dozen little bugs sitting inside the flower. And those are the males. They're sitting there waiting for the females to come along, and the pollination process for the flower takes place then. They're in most parts of California, it's a native bee that does the field pollination. And I hate to recommend you try hand pollinating. That's
Yeah.
a real challenge.
And I'm sorry, now I'm getting really, almost. I'm sorry, now I'm turning into a show in our tiny home. But it on the coastal areas, it can also be a question of too much moisture, fog, a little too much of that plant being wet all the time, and also a little too much fog layer. I call our months here the summer of fog, and if you're very close to the coast, sometimes it doesn't break through. Sometimes the sun does not break through.
Yeah.
And even when it does, it's not enough time. It's a couple hours, 4 hours that you're getting true sun exposure on those plants. And the rest of the time you're in that wet, misty fog. And that be the issue rather than the pollination issue. And getting a little bit technical with that could literally be that you're under the clouds during summer a lot more than you're in the sun.
Okay. No,
And
that makes sense.
How many
that's
hours?
veggie growing.
That makes sense. I just have one more quick question, hopefully, and then I'll let somebody else talk. And that is, in my 2 4x8
Nope.
flower beds, in my 2 4x8 flower beds, I had a beautiful lettuce all for like 10 months. And most of them were volunteers that popped up from the year before. And they started around October of last year, and then went all the way through about May. And then they all died. And then, so I have empty flower boxes, and I wanted to plant from seeds. And I planted seeds. I added my compost that I do a compost in there. I turned my soil and the whole bit. And, the lettuce had bolted. I heard you're supposed to let it bolt for next year, my volunteers. And I put seeds in there, and they come up, and they come up to like 1/4 of an inch, and then they all die. And I wonder, I have a lot of pill bugs. Do you think the bugs are eating my baby seed starters? Because nothing has been able to take,
Yes.
I might have one
Yeah.
carrot. Pill bugs are bad?
Yeah. They won't.
Yeah.
Yeah, they won't necessarily start with your little baby sprouts, but they typically will get there soon enough. They actually prefer decaying matter, but sow bugs can be quite a problem. And again, the Sluggo Plus will do a pretty good number on them.
Yeah. Okay. And I think I needed you.
I do. I think it's a really good, when you're starting with those starts, honestly, do a line, a sprinkle of Sluggo around each end of it, and sometimes in the middle, because that takes care of your pill bugs, it takes care of your earwigs, and it takes care of your snails. And the thing is, a lot of times it might be slugs and snails, and you don't see them during the day. They come out at night. And a good thing is, I barely make it past 9 p.m. these days in my life. But one time I was having a little a lot of trouble with my veggies, more than I suspected. And I went purposely at 11 p.m. to look at my veggies, and it was like a mess out there with slugs and snails that I did not see during daylight hours.
Okay.
To be that, and so it was Omni approved, and it's a great solution in situations like that, and protect your babies with that, and also make sure they're big enough. So we, before we them, that they're a pretty good healthy plant inside the little whatever we're growing them in, whatever you've bought them or how you're
That
growing
might be the problem.
yourself.
I'm growing
Don't
them in my
plant a
4x8.
teeny tiny baby plant.
Yeah, I'm putting my seeds directly in the
I know,
4x8.
but I mean the size of direct seeding. So in that situation, definitely some bird netting, which
I'm sorry, you're breaking up too much. I
version
can't hear you.
Bridget, we're having trouble hearing you.
I'm unfortunately not sure what I can do about that.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
all right. That's okay.
The direct seed,
Type in the chat.
Thank you.
if you're direct seeding, then the two things Bridget mentioned, I think are perfect. I would do exactly as she suggested. Use the Sluggo, which is entirely an organic product. It breaks down into iron sulfate, I think, and it will take care of that whole range of pests.
Okay.
And then the second thing is the nighttime patrol. I've done that more times than I can count. I haven't done it for a while because we haven't had a real snail problem for a while without enough ground moisture. But you just go out with a little paper or plastic bag and your gloves if you want them, and a flashlight once it's dark. And the snails, if you have snails in the garden, they'll be there. And again, as Bridget said, they're very hard to differentiate from the sow bugs or whoever else might be chewing on your little starts. And if it's birds, if it turns out that you don't have either of those problems and it's birds, then you can cover them usually.
Okay.
Just net them.
Thanks. I think I'll do that. And then maybe I was planting the wrong seeds. You know how she said there's a magic formula where you need to plant these seeds from seed and not from a transplant. I have to make sure maybe they were on the wrong list.
I do most of my flowers, honestly. I do most of my flowers as transplants. I
these were
direct
veggie
seed marigolds because
Yeah.
they just
These were
always
all-
come up and nobody seems to eat them.
These are all veggies. This was Swiss kale, carrots,
Oh,
Swiss chard, carrots, radishes are semi trying to hang in there. Even my new romaine lettuce I tried to put in there, couldn't pop it up. So maybe it's just the wrong thing in this season.
you never see it?
I would say 50% of them I didn't, 75% I didn't see, and about 10 to, I don't know, my math is wrong. I would say about 10 to 20% popped up. And then I think I have, of all the seeds I did in these, I might have 5 or 6 that might make it, but they're still not even a third of an inch tall and very small.
Okay. Radishes and carrots, unfortunately, I would highly recommend that you continue to direct seed. And as long as it looks like they're coming up, try to address the pest issue. And then if you're still not getting good germination, we've got something else to talk about.
Could be the seed quality too. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Are they new?
Yeah, I got them at the Whole Foods market this season. It said they were, planted for, this year. So I did check the back and they're recent.
Okay.
Yeah. They weren't the Renee's because they don't sell those anymore, but it's the other one.
Most of the nurseries do.
One thing I typed, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
One thing I typed, and I think I did it wrong and typed it to just Denise. But one thing that I typed is that it could also be bird pressure. Very young plants, when they're coming up, look like white worms, baby worms to birds. And you might need to choose some bird netting, which you can get at a local nursery, and you kind of just place that stakes over your baby transplants or your newly seeded plants. Our good friend Delise has a good trick. She just buys tulle at a little fabric store, which I don't know how to spell, so I'm sure I didn't spell it correctly. But it's at that wedding, veil tulle. Over some that can keep the birds out. Also, like little strips of metallic ribbon can scare the birds. So sometimes if you're direct seeding and they're coming up and like issues are coming that you're not sure what it is, it really could be that the birds are coming thinking those are worms. Pollination, something else, it's bird pressure.
Okay. Thank you.
Welcome.
Denise, you're muted.
Thank you. Okay, so we are past 6:30. If Bridget and Harry are willing to stay a while longer and answer questions, and that's fine. But just so everyone kind of knows where we're going, we'll go ahead and just keep recording so that when you get this, the recording, the link to it in the near future, you'll be able to listen to it anyway. So, but if you've got more questions, go ahead.
Please.
Yeah,
I'm
asking great questions.
I'm not sure I responded to everybody, but Mark asked if these were the types of questions that you could submit to the hotline, and absolutely, we'd love to hear from you.
Well, I'll ask one more if nobody's asking. That is, I put it in the chat before. I always get these mineral deposits in my water wands, those diffusers. They don't last but 2 or 3 months. Then does anybody have any secret so I don't have to keep buying new ones every 3 months, 2 months?
You can try soaking them in vinegar.
Does that work?
Yeah.
Okay.
They're calcium or magnesium or both deposits, and it's kind of a welcome to California sort of problem.
Yeah.
So
if you look at online, they'll do this kind of like 2-to-1 recipe, but honestly, I just soak them in vinegar, and that helps.
100% vinegar, not even water and vinegar.
Yeah, I don't usually delete it. You probably can, and then actually it makes a reasonably good.
It depends how
when you're done
is where I live. So I just go for the vinegar. I have, which is, I use vinegar that's a cleaning solution vinegar, and that works well for me. In San Diego times, when I lived there, I did the 2-to-1 recipe, and that was better. For up here where I am right now, straight vinegar. So it's one of those, it depends. Maybe start with the recipe, see if that works for you, and if it needs a little bit stronger, make it stronger.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question.
Yes.
Go ahead.
I want to find out what your philosophy is on tomato pruning. I've seen things where you take like the sucker out, when it comes out. And then I just saw something recently on Instagram where the person takes the leaf out, and because she wants a lot of tomatoes, but she doesn't care how big they are. And given that, I personally struggle with even I can do okay with the cherries, but I was curious if, what your strategy is, or if you prune them or if you don't prune them.
You want to go first? Or?
That's a great question, Joy. Harry and I were just talking about our run And from a perspective, there's not like a huge amount of scientific evidence of whether pinching those buds or not pinching those buds is effective. I, you know, worked and helped on farms for a while, and I consider our of our area, considering that's all she grew for years. She's with that, but I have a definitive answer whether it works or doesn't work or helps or doesn't help. And then Harry.
Yeah, I'm not recommending pinching blossoms in particular anymore, just because there isn't really a lot of publicly available research that supports it, and it's just a cultural thing. I was trained by a guy out of the tomato seed industry. He spent his whole career with tomatoes, and he does it. But if you come up to me and I'm supposed to tell you something that I've seen or at least heard about the science on, I can't with pinching blossoms. If we're talking about branches, you want to be careful in that there are two types of tomatoes: determinate, which tend to be smaller. They tend to be a little earlier, and they tend to fruit all at once. It's not hard. Most labels, even from the nursery, will tell you what it is. If not, if you Google it, you'll find out what your tomato is, whether it's determinate or indeterminate. Pruning determinates is very risky. I will prune them on the bottom to keep if it was a citrus tree, we'd call it a skirt. Just prune the leaves up off the bottom to reduce the contact with soil, and therefore soil viruses, bacterial problems, but not a lot in the structure of the plant, because they're only going to produce X number of tomatoes. And if you start cutting the branches out, regardless of which ones you take, you're most likely going to reduce the number of tomatoes you're getting out of that plant. If it's an indeterminate, like the sun gold, which was mentioned earlier, golly gee whiz, prune away. You couldn't slow one down if you wanted. The sun golds in particular are very prolific. I have to admit I like some of the fancier ones that breeders have come out with in the last couple of years, but sun golds are just incredibly dependable. It is, again, an indeterminate plant. It'll grow. I've had them reach 20, 25 feet on the roof of my house, as a matter of fact. Most tomatoes, in order to, you kind of want an airflow. You want to cut down on disease, everything from powdery mildew to some of the bacterial diseases. You want to have some airflow through that plant. So removing some of the interior branches on an indeterminate tomato is just fine. And whether you take the one that's growing out of the node or you take the outside one, doesn't matter. They're not a sucker, despite the fact that everybody in the whole world calls them one. They are not in the sense of a fruit tree. They will both produce all the leaves you want. They'll both produce all the fruit you want. They'll flower. There is to the tomato no difference. That's just the way that it grows. So if you've got one that's pointing down towards the ground where you don't want it to be, and the other one's pointing up, that's the one you should take, the one that's not going in the direction you want, and treat it a little bit like a fruit tree. As a general rule, I try not to remove more than about 10% of the plant at a time. A lot less than fruit tree, but again, it's just my otherwise I tend to make mistakes and end up cutting main branches, but yeah, up to about 10% is just fine.
And I think the biggest thing to keep in consideration in our area is how much sun those using over the, and for most of us, depending on where you live, you know, you might live more inland, you know, where you're getting a lot more sun. It might change for you. But where I live, I do not get enough sun to even grow slicers, let alone heirloom tomatoes. I don't have that much sun time. I have way much more fog time and cloudy time. Some days I've got like 4 hours sun max. So I stick with cherries because that's what does well here, you know. And I think sometimes people are feeling like their production of tomatoes is because they didn't pinch or prune correctly, when actually it was because they want 12 hours of sun. And most of us in our area don't get 12 hours of sun, you know. So that's, I think, something to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, you'll start seeing tomatoes in the nurseries early in March, and
Yeah.
I recommend that you resist the urge to plant until it's March for the tomato to actually grow. They're going to want temperatures above 50, if not 55 at night, at least frequently, and they're going to want daytime temperatures closer to 70 than 60 or whatever we were getting this last year.
Right.
I didn't plant mine until the second half of June. So you know, and it's the tomato won't necessarily die, it just won't do much, and it certainly won't be able to flower and fruit with temperatures that are too low. But if it spends an extra month sitting in the garden doing nothing, you're just increasing your chances for disease. So don't rush out and plant. Wait for it to warm up just a little bit, even though it never gets quite warm enough for us.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Denise, have we missed any other questions?
I'm not sure what you said because you really broke up, but we don't have any other questions in the chat. So
okay, and is there anyone else that wants to throw up their hand and ask us something before we end our session?
All right, I think looks like maybe we're good to go for this time. We'll meet again next month in August on the, wow. I did this wrong. The 17th, I believe, of August, which is another Thursday, 5 to 6:30. If any of you, I'll go ahead and send out an email in the next day or two, hopefully with the link to this recording, and also a request for you to look at our evaluation form and give us some idea how we're doing. And you can go ahead and reply to that email as well if you have any questions you'd like us to cover for sure. Like, for sure, don't miss it next time. So send any of those questions that you want to discuss in the group that way. Don't forget the hotline. That's a fabulous resource for you in the meantime. But anyway, hopefully that will keep us all on track.
And also our website will discuss our upcoming classes, and the next 2 classes are really question and answer focused. So that's our focus class, is that you start growing and then you'll come back like mid growing and end growing with your questions.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Bridget and Harry, for doing such a great job and answering all the questions. So there we go. And we'll see you all in about a month. Enjoy your gardens.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.